Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming. My name is Sylvan Leone. I am an associate professor here in the Department of Art. On behalf of the drawing and painting area and the Department of Art, thank you all for coming. Welcome. 12 or 13 years ago, I was friends with this art dealer in New York named Oliver Newton, who worked at the gallery Alexander and Bonin, and every time I ran into him or saw him somewhere, he would tell me about this incredible artist whose work I should look at, named Margaret Lee. What a brilliant artist she was, what a great painter. And then I'd see him sort of 3 months later, and he'd tell me again, you got to look at Margaret Lee. She's terrific, she's great. And long story short, he was absolutely right. And even though I never met her until today, it's such a pleasure to have a chance to introduce her here today. Margaret Lee is a New York-based artist, and along with her now husband, Oliver Newton, for the last 10 or 12 years, was the driving force behind the great New York Gallery 47 Canal, which represents artists such as Annika Yee and Josh Klein. Margaret Lee has organized and exhibited work at numerous venues, both domestically and internationally, including Misako and Rosen Gallery Tokyo. She was included in The Artist is Present, curated by Maurizio Catalan at the Youth Museum Shanghai, The Windows, Barneys, New York, Concentrations, HK, Margaret Lee, Made in LA 2014 at the Hammer Museum in Los Angeles, the 2013 Biennale de Lyon in France, Dida Duda at the Carpenter Center for the Visual Arts at Harvard University, Caza at the Bronx Museum, No Man's Land, Women Artists from the Rubell Family Collection in Miami, New Pictures of Common Objects curated by Christopher Liu at MoMA PS1, looking back at White Columns in New York, among others. Please help me in welcoming Margaret Lee.
Hi, thanks to the university and everyone in the department for inviting me. Recently I've been invited to speak to drawing and painting departments, which comes to some surprise because I did start my artistic trajectory as a sculptor. And I do feel in the deepest part of my soul I am a sculptor. And I've been using these opportunities to lecture about my practice, also for myself to trace the trajectory of my work from representational sculpture to abstract painting. So just to give you minimal background information on myself, I did not go to art school. I got a BA in US history and only took 3 studio art classes in college as an undergrad. But somehow I ended up taking a Sculpture 1 class and fell in love with it. And this is a slide of, to date me, a slide of the first artwork I ever made. The class assignment was to bring in something of sentimental value, and then we would learn how to carve that thing out of foam. And much to the confusion of my classmates, I brought in a postcard of the Alamo. Now, I have no connection to Texas. I had been there once, but just in revealing some of my biography, you know, I'm an immigrant child, and my father came here from Korea with, you know, his American dream to be a small business owner. And I think during that time, here's a picture of my father in front of his store in the Bronx. So the Bronx is actually very far from, you know, Texas and the Alamo. But in my mind, I think at this time, my father's American dream had died and he was closing his store. It just wasn't financially sound. Yet he always held on to this fantasy of the American dream. And so when I made the Alamo, I think as a US history major, I was sort of going through interrogations of westward expansion, the mythology of the American character, you know, manifest destiny and all the problems that are associated with the conquest of land that isn't yours. And that the Alamo was actually a failure. You know, many great American heroes died in this siege, yet it looms very large in Texas and American history as a symbol. So I was kind of interested in thinking through how failures are rejiggered into symbols of resistance in our American culture. So just to go backwards, I graduated in 2001 after, you know, making this sculpture and a couple of other sculptures, and I sort of realized that I'm pretty good at making things with my hands, and I was pretty good at making them look as they're supposed to, you know, like replicating things from life. It kind of came easy to me. It was never a struggle, and I just started feeling like maybe this is something I want to do. However, I graduated in 2001, and, you know, September 11th happened just 3 months later, and it was a pretty confusing time to graduate as a history major with dreams of being an artist, but I didn't have enough credits to apply to grad school. I would have had to like go back to school, go to undergrad, take art courses to apply for an MFA. I also didn't want to go into debt. So I spent a couple years exploring life, not being that productive, and which brings me to this sculpture. So in 2006, 2007, I was actually contemplating whether or not I should move to a commune, and I was really interested in sustainable farming. And I was kind of at a fork in the road. Like, I could follow that path, which was very creative. I could take the sort of artistic dream that I had and sort of channel it into farming. Or maybe I give it one more shot and try to make it in the New York art world. So I was trying to think of something that I could make that was cheap, that I had skill set, and that I could sort of replicate. And so I just looked at a potato, and I just thought, this is a very common staple food. I bought a potato from the supermarket, made a very simple mold, which I'd learned in my undergrad sculpture class how to do mold making, and cast this potato out of pottery plaster and just painted it. And then I just thought, maybe this is something that can help me make my way into the New York art world. I mean, it seems kind of far-fetched, but linking it to my biography, it's not so shocking that the daughter of a food seller, you know, someone who had a grocery store, might also use food to make it into a new industry, a new world. So I started working. You know, I started making casts of simple things like cucumbers, bananas, oranges, and trying to weave them in to larger interrogations about value, where things belong, you know, what constitutes high art, high design. So I really like just taking these very simple things and mixing them with, you know, high modernist design. During this time, I was mostly making these types of sculptures, you know, taking fruits and veg, making simple molds, and then, you know, painting them and placing them in different contexts. I was playing with photography at that time as well, which I think was really important as a sculptor to start understanding how to think through a different medium. So sculpture is seen in the round, but I started photographing my own sculptures in situations. I didn't know at the time why, but I was really interested in flattening the view. So this is an installation from my PS1 show. And so you can kind of see this juxtaposition between like photography and sculpture and installation. And on the right, this is like just, you know, the typical advertisement for real estate, you know, some real estate agent who's selling multi-million-dollar condos in New York. And I've always been struck by pictures like this because art and sort of abstract modernist art has always been used in the backdrop to signify like high culture and wealth. This man looks very distinguished, so I would sort of play with that and like, you know, buy a Corbusier chair and then, you know, place a watermelon on it. I'm not sure if the watermelon was supposed to be a stand-in for me or a send-up to the sitter. You know, I kind of left it sort of open-ended in that way. And it sort of all culminated, I got invited to do the windows at Barneys. If you don't know what Barneys is, it's not open any longer, but it was an extremely high-end department store in New York City. And the creative director there invited me to make various windows within the department store, but this one in particular kind of like brought together some of these concepts of what I was kind of addressing when I was making these fruit sculptures, because I found that when I was being invited to collectors' houses, they would always joke like, oh, my housekeeper keeps putting your sculptures in the pantry, because so many of these kitchens that I would go into didn't even look like kitchens. Like I'd be like, where is your refrigerator? Do you have an oven? There was sort of no signs of life or any food stuff in the kitchen. And so it was sort of a play on that, like the kitchen is actually just like another curated space for a sort of what I would think is an unattainable lifestyle. So the banana in this case is like a chrome banana, as if like the only sign of life would be a chromed banana and then like a beautiful Margiela cape, kind of like an apron, and like who has a rug in their kitchen, right? It's just sort of signaling like all the things that would keep you from actually cooking and doing something that's sort of human. However, after a couple of years of sort of interrogating this type of class value, these aspirations, you know, 2016 was a very pivotal year in this country, and I started questioning my own perspective. You know, was my focus too small? All I was doing was sort of interrogating one objects, right, and how they exist in very particular contexts. And I just started to zoom out, and you know, New York City was going through a very dramatic change where this is a building that's now standing right north of the Manhattan Bridge. You can kind of tell how much larger it is than the rest of the buildings downtown. And this was sort of the direction New York was heading towards, but at the same time, under these developments, this is the state of our infrastructure. You know, the subway is actually New York City's greatest asset. And so the contradiction between like these towers that were being built to the sky for, who knows, right, for investment capital, it didn't seem like anyone was living in them, and then the deterioration of our subway, I just started feeling that maybe my interrogations of these very specific objects was keeping me from expanding my own perspective, right? And so I think as an artist, you always have to question, like, did you run this course through? Is this the end of the line? Are you going to pivot? Where do you go next, right? So in 2016, this is my last show that was strictly sculpture. And I mean, it's funny because you can obviously tell I want to paint because all of the things in this fountain are sort of very typical painter studio things. And this ladder sculpture is actually a fountain. And so I think I was really thinking about movement. You know, sculpture is very stagnant unless you're making kinetic sculpture. So I think in my mind I wanted to understand materiality that wasn't so fixed. And this is the press release I wrote for the show. And I always like to write a little text for every show I've done. Sometimes there's a formal press release attached, but it's very helpful to me to write something to myself. And I like to look back because it kind of gives me clues as to where I was mentally. And I think that last sentence, like, would you want that in your house, was really me questioning, like, oh, I spent all this time, you know, making these kind of like funny fruit, vegetable sculptures because I knew they could sort of easily make passage into a home. And I just started thinking, like, maybe I don't want that passage into someone's home or collection to be as easy. And so these are just some details. I think also like puncturing this hat and giving the viewer something to look through was another indication that I was trying to move away from sculpture. And this is just a series of bananas on a rope. During this time as well, because I just started getting involved in anti-displacement efforts downtown, and I'll go through a series of these pictures that kind of documented some of the campaigns I got involved in. And so you can see just like the aesthetic difference between, say, the advertisement of the real estate agent in a chair with abstract art behind him, as opposed to like what I was experiencing as I decided to sort of pan out and have a larger perspective. You know, all of this is the same neighborhood where I was making work in my studio downtown, not knowing these fights were going on. And I sort of immersed myself in this and sort of understanding, like, when I was questioning value, maybe I should have also questioned what makes community and who often gets overlooked within communities. So, you know, there are various things like people being evicted from their buildings, hunger strikes, celebrations. I made that piñata, which actually became very important, I think, to like helping me choose color palettes, and like I started making silver paintings. You know, when I first started making paintings, I was questioning myself, is this random? Where are these shapes coming from? Where's the color coming from? But then I looked back at this pivot in my life and how my life went from, you know, being in a very sort of isolated art environment to being very engaged in my community, and how that influenced what type of art I ended up making. This is the evicted families being rehoused. We won. We took the city to court, and they got rent stabilization, so we're celebrating in front of their building. You know, various protests against development in the neighborhood. It was a really amazing thing to be able to take my artistic skills and, you know, make signs and posters that were very explicit. You know, it wasn't this, oh, what am I really saying? I'm going to avoid being explicit, which sometimes we do in art. Actually, my life started becoming very explicit. This is a campaign to end the 24-hour workday in New York. Home attendants in New York work 24-hour shifts, sometimes days on end, and only get paid for 13. This is the Gowanus Canal. They're cleaning it up, which is great, but it's also leading to more development. This is a poster. This is a wall at the local public library downtown. You know, so like as I'm like experiencing these things, I'm also in my studio experimenting on how to take in all of this information and all of these real concrete struggles. And then, you know, like, what am I gonna make art about? And on one side, like, my life started becoming very explicit. Like, we would read legal documents, we would work with lawyers, we would build cases. And that part of my brain was so exhausted that I found myself in my studio wanting to just abstract as a way to spend time. There were so many things I had to think through when doing my community work that my artistic practice actually changed into a time of processing information without an end goal, right? And I think that's where abstraction became something I wanted to work towards. So I started thinking, like, you know, before I was making these perfect watermelons that had no use value. You know, they had like commercial value maybe in the art market, and then sort of looking at what use value really is, like what sustenance really is. I mean, this is the type of stuff I was immersed in. I started organizing with a worker center called Chinese Staff and Workers Association, and in 1986, they actually sued New York City to stop luxury development, and they set this amazing precedent where there's a thing called an environmental review. Before a developer can develop, they have to prove that they won't damage the environment. And this worker center actually sued the city, saying the environmental review process didn't include people within the environment, and that gentrification actually affects people, and people are part of the environment, so this building cannot be built because the environmental review didn't include their well-being. And they won, and this set a huge precedent in terms of cases moving forward. And I started rethinking these spaces, you know, like, well, who builds the aesthetics of these very active spaces, you know, spacers where workers are organizing with each other, organized within their communities. Things were just opening up in my mind in ways that I mean, it actually took me a really long time to process because the art world is so highly curated. And it is confusing what the use value is. And so when I was in these spaces and like making banners, I knew exactly what the use value was. This is a very blurry slide, but it just talks about the real wage and worker productivity and the gap between and how things change. You know, like really thinking about, I mean, true value, right? The value we create as working people, as opposed to the value I was sort of obsessing over, which is like who in a rarefied art industry gets to determine the market value of an object. Which kind of got me to abstract painting. It might seem like a jump aesthetically, but the other thing that was going on in my life was I started really researching and delving into psychoanalysis. And I read this book, The Shell and the Kernel, and I came across this sentence and it just stopped me in my tracks. And it's, again, like mostly the last line. Although to what of an illusion must necessarily stop short of articulation. And I really started to think through this process of, as an artist, do I really need to be articulate? What am I trying to prove? Or is this art practice something for me to actually stop short of articulation and exist within this, what I would call like an utterance. When I did this dee-da-doo-da show at the Carpenter, it was sort of that. Like, I could read as much theory as I wanted. I could be as explicit as I wanted to be in a press release. However, maybe there's more work to be done in this dee-da-doo-da, right? It's sort of your subconscious. Like, how does your subconscious come to the front? I don't think it's about being articulate. I think it's actually being inarticulate that sort of allows that connection. And so I did this show and, you know, basically tried to work this through. Reciprocation is an elusive thing. Stop short of articulation. It's okay to make yourself unintelligible. I see what you mean. I wanted to exist in a place where me and my work could be inarticulate with one another. So this is just some installation photos of my first official painting show. But even in that show, I'm still working through my ideas through sculpture. So in order to get to the paintings, I was taking old boxes, like sugar boxes and flat cookie boxes and stuff, and I was decoupaging newspaper on top of them. Because again, like, I have a very clear understanding of art through sculpture, and in order to make my way to painting, I kind of had to practice on sculptures. And I wanted to now contrast that to the writing I did for my first solo show in New York, which is actually extremely explicit. Like, I literally just list the things that I made in the show. And I think it's because I didn't know what I was doing, and so I actually tried to use this explicit language to cover my tracks. And so, you know, looking back, I was thinking, like, oh, it's so interesting when you're sort of more clear with yourself, to be inarticulate feels more comfortable. But when you're very confused, you feel like you have to overcompensate and, like, really prove some sort of factual evidence. So this is my first show in New York, and, you know, there is a giant painting in that show. I did make that painting, but I never wanted it to be seen as a painting. I wanted that to be seen as an object, as if my subjectivity was nowhere within that work. You know, it was just like, I'm a scenic painter, my assignment is make a jungle curtain. The same way, you know, I'm like, I need to make a watermelon. I know how to make a plaster cast and then make this plaster thing look exactly like a watermelon. I want to make a zebra skin. You know, I just replicate something from life. This process was very satisfying because I knew when it was over. You know, I'm like, yes, it's done. It looks like a watermelon. It's passable. Move on. And that was the thing that I think I felt limited by, because as I started moving towards painting, I sort of liked this challenge of knowing when something was done. This is another show I did in New York, which I almost considered this my first painting show. It's all white sculptures, and I did hand paint those dots, and my idea was I was wanting, again, to flatten this view. So how do you take a 3D plane and flatten it? And I think that was like my baby step towards gesture. So just to return to this book that has been extremely important to me, it's the thing that they talk about is like to restore the lines of communication with those intimate recesses of the mind that have, for one reason or another, been denied expression. That is the thing that I started really becoming extremely committed to, and I did feel that abstraction was the only way for me to access these recesses. I mean, you can read these. I don't have to read them aloud. So the next couple of slides, it's almost like stream of consciousness. They zip back and forth in terms of the timeline. And there's like the informal and the formal photography. And it just shows like things I was like, on the right, like a setup that, you know, I made before I made my first abstract painting show. You know, how do I work through things? What materiality is like repeating? The gesture of the hose and how it coils. How does that relate to a rope? You know, things like that. You know, this is on the left a photograph I'd made it's printed as a dye sublimation print, so it's a photo printed on metal, so that I could start painting on them. I mean, extremely suggestive, but you can kind of see like motion and gesture really kind of coming to the fore. Then again, like, never really leaving the sculpture behind, the fruit and veg, but trying to rejigger what becomes prominent. This is a show that I made. Actually, this is my last sculpture show, I lied. And I actually think this is a really interesting show that I did, because when you make polished stainless steel sculptures, when the viewer looks at them, the sculptures disappear, right? Like, it's all reflection back. And then on the floor is this little paper mache cloud that I made that did a figure 8 around it. And again, like, my obsession with movement, using card parts, really wanting to step away from this being stagnant. And I think, even though the material itself, stainless steel, is quite strong and heavy, it does disappear. And just connecting it back to some older, fruit and vegetable work that I was making, and kind of showing different variations of sculptures I had made when I was putting a view through a sculpture. Moving towards like airiness, trying to make these clouds. And so part of this is really thinking through this concept of incorporation versus introjection. So incorporation, according to the psychoanalysis, is a fantasy where introjection is a process. And so, this is only a couple years apart. This is my last solo show at Jack Hanley, and then this is the solo show that follows. The rope is still present, but instead of using it, in a very explicit manner of a hanging device, and then these bananas that are very literal, I took the rope and I didn't actually know what I was using it for. I just started to complicate the material, and I held it together with these nails, which led to this show, which was mostly paintings, but again, like, there's always a sculptural element generally within my work, or there's always been a painting element within my work when it's mostly a sculpture show. And, it's still me using a sculptural material to think about gesture. I didn't really have the muscle memory baked in to know gesture, but I knew it through other materials. So this is the little text that I wrote for this show. This show did open during COVID, so maybe my concept around bad immediately, I wouldn't say it was a pessimistic show, but it was sort of acknowledgement that things are bad and maybe opportunities arise through this process of getting through. And so for this show, I was carrying through the newspaper that I'd used previously, and I actually started on raw linen and gessoed the canvases myself. And I found myself wanting to leave certain parts empty, and I think it's because this whole show is influenced by the New York City subway. And I wanted to address like how parts of the ground are always ignored. And so I didn't want to take for granted the perfectly gessoed painting surface as a given. That actually in life, sometimes the ground, the most important part of our lives, is uncared for. I mean, it actually is quite beautiful, but very shocking. If you've ever been to other countries with gleaming public transportation, it's extremely shocking. And I mean, just in terms of like thinking through being inarticulate, as I became more inarticulate in my artwork because I was going into abstraction, I found that I was able to be more articulate as a writer. I think because painting allowed me this process to spend time with my thoughts without an end goal. Whereas when I was making those watermelons, potatoes, you know, I had the end goal, I had the ideal. So that's sort of like the fantasy. The fantasy ideal is the perfect watermelon outside of nature, whereas abstraction was more of the process of, we shall see. I'm not quite sure what the ideal is. I mean, you know, I'm looking at the subway. I wouldn't think that anyone would look at those pictures of the subway and think that that's like an idealized version of life. So it was actually sort of the fact that I was able to write about my own work with clarity was sort of signaling to me that something was working. So here are these paintings up close where you can see, you know, where I've not gessoed the paintings and some of the newspaper up close. And this is a tunnel that runs along the FDR highway, which I've been driving since I was a child. I have memories of it. And these markings, I'm pretty sure, indicate that there's something wrong with the wall. Yet I can't recall it ever being fixed. And so the markings just keep getting like more and more intense. And I just think it's interesting, like how I went from like obsessing over these idealized forms of vegetables and fruits, high design, mid-century modern, Barneys, window, to then like finding all of my inspiration in the neglected public works of New York City. So these are just some more sort of passages from The Shell and the Kernel about introjection versus incorporation. I don't need to read it aloud. And this is a very recent painting, and I just added this because, you know, it was just something I made, and I definitely had it wasn't working towards an exhibition. I wasn't thinking about an ideal of anything, and this painting came very easily to me. And you know, I think it's just thinking through all these concepts that actually allows it creates this freedom that I've just found I'm very grateful for. You know, again, you can look up this book. I'm sure there's a PDF somewhere, but just kind of concepts about introjection. So one of the things that I really loved about this concept of introjection was, I'm not a psychoanalyst and I'm not a psychologist, so I'm not an expert in this, but how I understood it was, when you're an infant, the way you signal that you need help or care is you utter. You go, ah, ah, ah. You have no language yet. And so in that utterance, the adults around you and your caregivers offer you things, the bottle, the nipple, you know, the sustenance. As you get older and you develop words and language, you start being able to articulate. I need milk. I need food. I need a diaper change. However, just because you've learned to articulate what you need does not mean your needs are met. Actually, your needs were probably met more so when you were a helpless infant, sort of just like screaming. and everyone's trying to figure out what's wrong, and you're sort of they're trying everything to get you to stop crying. And so they talk about this concept in terms of like an empty mouth feel, that like your utterance is often silenced with a full mouth, which would be a bottle of milk. But when you start articulating, it doesn't guarantee that you're going to get it, because somehow language can keep you from getting the very things that you need. And this is my most recent show that I did in South Korea, in Seoul. And it's the first show I've ever done without sculpture. This is years of like, reading this book, thinking through concepts of introjection, all my political work, all my organizing work. What it brought me to was like a really clear understanding of place. I didn't move around during COVID. I kind of looked at the same subway stops over and over again. I wasn't going anywhere exotic. I was really committed to my community. And this is the text that I ended up writing. And this is a view from the Major Deegan Expressway of a broken window, which sort of like, again, this idea of like what gets broken and never repaired, and what that means, not just personally, but in terms of an infrastructure that keeps a city like New York moving. And so I started thinking through, I'm not going to say figuration again, but the landscape started coming into view, and I was really thinking about life not through a frontal perspective, but one that moves past you in your periphery. And sort of what usually gets ignored as you're sort of moving forward with a perspective that feels directional, moving towards something, I actually started wanting to think about all the things that you sort of disassociate as it moves past you. And so this is my first real artist statement, which I'm going to say took me like 14 years to be able to write. And I guess I should read this aloud. There's a stretch of highway that looms large in my memory and has recently been reincorporated into my local movements with some regularity. So this is this highway, the Major Deegan. This road, though not particularly unique, is marked by a chaotic junction point where the two straight parallels are interrupted by circuitous ramps that lead to elevated archways. Passing through and under this amalgamation of infrastructure was one thing once thrilling, but over the years became something to endure. I didn't think much of this directional move towards my origin point, as the familiarity of the road allowed for an easing back into a disassociative state where the experience of the present dissolved into my tangled memories of the past. An understanding of place was seemingly a given, being that up until a few years ago, I had never lived further than 10 miles from my place of birth. So this kind of comes from me thinking through making a show and exhibiting in South Korea, the very country my parents left because they felt they didn't have any opportunities there. So they displaced themselves from their homeland to make their way as immigrants in the Bronx, and then Yonkers. And so I was really having a hard time understanding how I then, as this next generation that's supposed to be carrying his American dream, would go back to the very place he felt unwelcomed and felt that he had no way forward. And he was really dealing with, I actually don't have a place in my parents' homeland. My homeland, my place, is a very small area of New York that I've been driving for, the 43 years, or like moving through the 43 years I've been here. I've never really lived anywhere else. never really left. Went to college there, you know, started working in New York. And I started thinking about that opportunity of what it means to not see that as a stuck situation, that even though your place doesn't change, if your mentality changes and your perspective changes, you start seeing all these other things. And so, yeah, I think that that's also what allowed me to not include sculpture, you know, not put newspaper on the canvas, to not use ropes or nails and screws. I still love making sculptures, and I still do understand the world through sculptures, but you know, I just bring this up to say how long things take, but also how grateful I am to the commitment to a process that is very confusing to oneself. So I just wanted to play this video because I don't know how many of you are from the East Coast, but I love the internet that there are things like this. Someone filmed the very junction point that I was talking about, because I didn't know how to describe this experience of driving through this chaos. And so is this gonna play? Oh, sorry. I don't know if we can, yeah, I hit the link. Oh, I don't know why the video's not playing. Is that? No, sorry. Well, I guess I can send you the video. But I actually was very surprised that there was this video that existed that literally could show you guys exactly what I had experienced many times over and over again, and how that might lead to, you know, making these types of paintings. I think, to conclude, I really enjoyed this process of becoming very secure as to what type of human being I want to be within my community, and being very clear in my place. And that when I became less confused about that, it did allow me to experiment and really like throw myself into this unknown with, I mean, obviously everyone's insecure about making art, but this commitment that, like, you know, you don't get to just make your ideal over and over again, which I was doing with these other, you know, my earlier works. I always thought that was the sort of point of life, but now I'm just in a place where I suppose I might just be making these for a really long time, and, you know, maybe they'll get better, maybe they'll get worse, and I'll make sculptures, but it's committing to that time to process my experience in the world, and having a clear understanding of how I see the world and how my place of belonging. So I think that's time for 10 minutes of Q&A. So I'll end there. Thank you. Does anyone have any questions? Oh, wait, how are we doing this? Okay, we'll just start from this way. Gentleman in the hat.
So you were saying when you were showing us the sculpture in that ad of the real estate agent for the abstract paintings like that, symbolize like status and wealth. Did you think of that when you moved to abstract painting?
It was funny because you would think, right? Like, I'm like, wow, I'm doing the very thing I used to make fun of. Like, I would collect these advertisements of like fake abstract paintings in situ in these condos, being like, oh, I'm never gonna do that. But you know, you sort of have to question, like, why am I being so critical of this thing on the outside? Like, I was always pointing the interrogation outwards, which is, I think, really good. But sometimes you also have to point it inwards, and you're not really in control of like what emerges. So, trust me, it was extremely shocking. I had a hard time showing them because in my mind, I couldn't balance like all of the cynicism I'd had around the market and why abstraction is always valued more than this, and why do abstract expressionist painters get to reign supreme, and why is it so gendered, and you know, all of these things. You know, you can always question the external, but if you're only pointing outward, I think you're doing yourself a disservice. So, next question. Woman. Oh, yeah, that's, well, that's kind of why I showed some of those just snapshots of my life in community. Because I also had to wonder, initially I think I was being a little bit of a shithead, being like, I'm a girl painter, so my paintings are gonna be pink. You know, like, it's still in that sort of critical mind of like, oh, painting with an eye roll, I want to stay distant to this, and if people ask, I'm just going to be like, I'm a girl, that's why they're pink. But it's actually, when I was looking through my photos of just my life, I did start noticing like, oh, these balloons and like Chinese New Year celebrations and confetti and the accoutrements of these spaces that were not art spaces, like in the library. Why are these colors appearing, or why am I being attracted to those colors? So, you know, if I wanted to not reveal anything personal, I would just kind of hold a ironic position. But that's why I did show some of those more casual snapshots. Any other questions? If not, we can try to get the video going. Yes?
How have your paintings been received in contrast to your sculpture?
I think because I was always showing them alongside of sculpture. It's hard to say, actually. Like, the people who know my practice have always known that I've been a painter in quotes. Like, oh, I only use painting in this quotational way, and I'm kind of good at it, but like, that's nothing I'm gonna lean on because I wanna be more critically minded. So people who knew my work could see it. Actually, when I made like that zebra skin, or even when I painted a watermelon, like the watermelon itself, or even the potato, was kind of the similar mentality of when I make abstract paintings. Like, disassociate, go somewhere else. If you think too much about it, it's never gonna work. You have to just sponge these translucent layers onto this object until somehow you know when to stop, right? So I sort of I liked making those works because I did like spending the time in that headspace, which was, I mean, who really knows what I was thinking through? Because if I thought too much about any one thing, it would block the process of like this magical transformation of like a white plaster object into something that's passable as a watermelon. So, you know, there were elements of that, but to go into this like full abstraction, I think some people are confused, but I think also like we think that everyone's paying attention, but some people don't even know that I made sculpture, right? Like, just because you can track your trajectory doesn't mean your audience is doing it. And I think that's something that's been helpful to me.
What is the most difficult thing about being abstract?
To keep it from being representational, right? Like, as much as you want to not, it's like you don't want to reveal the form, right? But what is influencing me, as I've shown in the photos, is so much form, right? Sculptural things or things I'm seeing in the subway, like these are real life things. And so I really wanted to be able to pull from my experience within the world. For me, the hardest thing is like, I don't want to be so much of an introvert and like obsessed with my own interiority that I've turned away from the world, right? That's my biggest challenge, because with abstraction, you could also just go into the sort of mental place with your subconscious, like you're pulling something out of nowhere, but is it grounded to anything, right? And I've felt that when I don't feel a grounding, the paintings kind of go sideways. And so how do you hold that balance of being grounded to something without quite revealing the very thing, which brings it into representation? Does that make sense? And also the colors. That's why I don't use. I cannot, it's always been black and white, one color, magenta. Sometimes there's some raw sienna in there to change the magenta. Silver. Silver's not really a color. But it's also interesting how much paint moves, right? So like silver on top of black gesso renders very differently. Silver on top of white gesso. I didn't know that, I mean, oil painting is so fun in that way. Like, it moves so quickly. You know, you add a drop of raw sienna into magenta and you get a totally different palette. And so I don't know how to balance the colors. So I've found that to be very difficult, which is why I've limited my palette. We have 3 minutes. Any last questions?
Do you experience synesthesia, and does that play a part?
I don't.
Okay.
I don't. I mean, to be quite honest, sometimes I read these really difficult texts and then I don't really know what they mean. And so then I'm like, okay, maybe if I just paint and think, like when I'm reading through this book about psychoanalysis, this is not a very easy book to read as like a layman. So I'll sort of read like a passage and just be like, what is that? And then I'll just try to like think through it in my head and then I'll paint. And I think that's another form of grounding, where I'm like thinking through a concept. And it's not just like an abstract concept, it's something I want to understand. Or so like when I showed that graph about like the real wage, workers' productivity, that's something I really want to understand, because also the economy seems very confusing. Like, I don't understand it. What does this mean? I don't understand. Why is the real wage here? What is that? Like the gap between like, you know, the real wage and what we're paid, and that gap in between is exploitation, and what does this mean, and how does that affect the larger economy? You know, like these are very complex things that if you're not in school majoring in it and you want to understand it, you kind of have to devote a lot of time to sort of turning it over in your head. And when you're doing like wet on wet oil painting, I've found that just that physical act of like, oh, I thought I understood this, but 5 minutes later, this is a completely different painting. You know, when you're like in your wet on wet moments, you're like, wow, I don't know where my lines went. How did that all change? And I think that's just like a mental process I like to experience, which helps me understand sort of theoretical concepts.
Referencing that empty mouth, full mouth concept, do you feel like you've been able to sort of receive and be more open to different things as a result of this kind of being a reflection of more of an empty mouth, since it's abstract versus your more representational pieces?
Yeah, definitely. That allowing myself the full mouth, which I would say is utterance, right? The inarticulateness is what the full mouth is, as opposed to language, which kind of leads to an empty mouth. But at the same time, because I've been so committed to it, the transformation has been, okay, so now I've gone from utterance, dee-da, doo-da, to being able to write an artist statement, right? That's very clear, that I'm not revealing my trauma. I don't want anyone to know anything of that. But the process of it is something that I think is very helpful. It's not the personal details. And so how do you go from like dee-da-do-da to writing a press release, right? It's like language isn't bad. It's just that introjection process, right, of like accepting the process that helps you build your own language to sort of address what you need in terms of reality, as opposed to developing a fantasy of what you need based in nothingness, which only leads to disappointment, right? So it's this commitment to, I have a pretty strong no hopes and dreams policy, so that's where that, I'm not a pessimist, I just don't believe in hopes and dreams. Like you set up, you develop a process, you sort of look at the concrete, you sort of figure out, you analyze the situation as it changes. So like the ideal solution can't be ideal forever because everything changes. And so when I'm like trying to show this video of like this highway, I'm like, to think about having a memory of this highway as an infant to now, and every change that's happened along this road, is just something I've been thinking through in terms of that development of language.
Thank you so much.
Okay. Thank you.